Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're trying to cut through some pretty dense layers of secrecy, the kind that surrounds global conflicts, covert operations.
Yeah, stuff that has a huge impact on real people, on geopolitics, but it's often hidden.
Exactly. So our mission really is to give you a kind of fast track, a clear path through a big stack of material, articles,
Here
reports.
to pull out the critical insights for you.
Right. We're focusing today on let's say, a critical area. Alleged war crimes, human rights violations, illegal funding, even conspiracy theories tied to U.S. foreign policy and intelligence.
And just to be clear, this isn't about taking sides, not at all. It's about looking really meticulously at the material we've got, uncovering key facts, maybe some surprising connections.
Yeah, and those ripple effects, the stuff you don't always see. We'll be unpacking things like, documented abuse in prisons, but also these shadowy, decades-long covert networks.
The kind that influenced global politics.
Uh-huh.
And their unintended consequences, right? That's a big theme.
Definitely. Situations where actions taken for one reason led to something totally different, often, frankly, devastating. So yeah, let's get into it. To some critical, maybe unsettling ground we're covering.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. Maybe begin with some of those direct, really disturbing instances. Alleged war crimes, human rights abuses that have just, left a massive mark.
And Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. It's hard to avoid starting there, isn't it?
It is. And the thing is, the allegations started almost right away, didn't they? Right with the invasion?
Yeah, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, they had oversight pretty early on, and they were submitting reports raising serious concerns about how detainees were being treated.
So this wasn't something that just suddenly appeared years later.
No, not at all. In fact, it was one of those ICRC reports that directly led Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez, he was the commander there, then to appoint Major General Antonio Taguba to investigate. That was January 1st, 2004.
Okay, so the alarm bells were ringing internally quite early.
They were formally communicated right up the chain. And Taguba's investigation, what did it find?
Well, the Taguba report came out just a month later, February 2004. And it was, let's just say, damning is putting it mildly.
How so?
It detailed, quote, numerous incidents of sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses inflicted on several detainees. Crucially, it didn't paint them as isolated incidents.
So it saw a pattern.
Exactly. It concluded this was systemic and illegal abuse, intentionally perpetrated by several members of the military police guard force. Systemic, that's the key word.
Wow. And the report mentioned photos too, right? Even back then.
It did. Widespread photographic evidence, though, importantly, the report itself wasn't released publicly at the time.
Which immediately makes you wonder about the culture, the oversight.
Yeah.
If it's systemic.
Precisely. It raises huge questions.
But that secrecy couldn't last forever, obviously. Those photos eventually came out.
Right. March 15th, 2006, Salon magazine published this huge cache. It was staggering, really. 1,325 images, 93 video files, all showing suspected detainee abuse.
Just unbelievable numbers.
And it got worse. The collection also had 546 images of suspected dead Iraqi detainees.
Oh my God.
Yeah, plus 37 images showing military working dogs being used in the abuse, and even pictures of soldiers in, simulated sex acts, or one with a swastika drawn between his eyes.
It's just graphic evidence of deliberate degradation. Horrifying.
It painted an undeniable picture.
And behind those images were individual stories, equally horrific.
Right.
Like Manadel al-Jamadi.
Right. He died in November 2003. He was a prisoner, interrogated, tortured allegedly by CIA officer Mark Swanner and Army specialist Sabrina Harmon.
And his body. That's one of the infamous photos, isn't it?
It is. After he died, his corpse was packed in ice. And there are these widely reprinted photos of specialists Sabrina Harmon and Charles Grainer grinning, giving thumbs-ups next to his body.
Shelling. What happened legally?
Well, a military autopsy officially declared his death a homicide. Attorney General Eric Holder even opened a criminal investigation in 2011 into the CIA personnel involved.
Okay, so there was an investigation.
There was. But ultimately in 2012, no charges were brought.
No charges for a death ruled a homicide. With photos like that.
None against the CIA personnel, no. That lack of accountability, especially at higher levels or involving intelligence agencies, that's a recurring theme here.
What about the soldiers on the ground? What was their perspective?
Well, Army Reserve Staff Sergeant Ivan Frederick, one of the soldiers later convicted, kept a video diary. It offered some really troubling insights.
Like what?
He talked about the abuse of CIA prisoners, specifically noting they were never processed and therefore never had a number.
So, basically invisible. Off the
It
books.
seems like it. Deliberately bypassing official procedures, meaning no conventional oversight. And Frederick went further. He implicated military intelligence, MI. He said MI personnel were present and witnessed such activity. And not only that, but they encouraged and told us, great job, saying they were getting positive results and information.
Wow. So direct encouragement for abuse to get intelligence.
That's what his diary suggests. A dynamic where intelligence goals just trumped basic human rights.
That clashes pretty starkly with what the leadership was saying, though, right?
It does. General Sanchez, for instance, had told the American Journal of International Law that some prisoners were intelligence assets, implying they maybe weren't entitled to full Geneva Conventions protection.
A controversial interpretation, to say the least.
Very. And then you had the final report of the independent panel to review Department of Defense detention operations, the Schlesinger report. It found no evidence that organizations above the 800th MP Brigade or the 205th MI Brigade level were directly involved.
So, contradicting Frederick's account.
Yeah.
Containing the blame lower down.
Essentially, yes. It creates this really confusing picture. How can abuse be systemic, as the Taguba report said, but higher-level organizations weren't directly involved? It doesn't quite add up. It leaves that question of ultimate responsibility hanging.
But there has been some accountability recently, hasn't there? Though maybe not through the military channels.
That's right. A really significant development, actually. November 12, 2024, a U.S. federal jury found the private military contractor Secrecy Premier Technology liable for torture at Abu Ghraib.
CACI.
The contractor.
Yes, they provided interrogation services. The jury awarded $42 million in damages to 3 Iraqi plaintiffs, Suhail al-Shamari, Asad Zubayeh, and Salah Ali-Jali.
$42 million, that's substantial.
It is. $3 million compensatory and $11 million punitive damages for each plaintiff. It's a landmark case because it holds a private contractor accountable in a U.S. court for abuses committed overseas during wartime operations.
So even if military or intelligence figures avoided charges, a private company was held liable. That's interesting.
It is. It shows that sometimes the civil courts can provide an avenue for accountability when other systems fail, especially concerning the role of private actors in warfare.
How did Iraqis react back when the scandal first broke? Bush apologized, right?
He did, and the reaction in Iraq was, well, mixed. CNN reported some felt he was being frank, dealing with it openly.
Others weren't satisfied. Not at all. Many felt it wasn't enough, wanted a more comprehensive apology, maybe even reparations. But there was also this other layer.
Yeah.
Yahya Said, an Iraqi scholar, noted the news was almost surprisingly low-key in Iraq itself. Because rumors of abuse were already so widespread, people weren't necessarily shocked by the content.
So this already suspected this stuff was happening.
Exactly, which led to cynicism. People were asking, why now? Suspecting, quote, some scheming going on, some agenda in releasing the pictures at this particular point.
That idea that information release is tied to political agendas, we'll probably see that again.
Unfortunately, yes. It's a recurring suspicion when dealing with these kinds of revelations.
Okay, let's shift focus, look back a bit further. My Lai. It's another name that just instantly evokes horror, this time from the Vietnam War.
And sadly, My Lai wasn't necessarily an isolated anomaly in terms of civilian killings during that conflict.
Really? How so?
Well, there's a confidential letter from a sergeant sent in May 1970 to Army Chief of Staff Westmoreland. He described civilian killings happening on the scale of a My Lai each month for over a year during 1968-69.
A My Lai each month.
That's what he claimed. And there were other letters, too, from different soldiers signed Concerned Sergeant, describing similar widespread civilian killings during pacification operations. It suggests a deeply troubling pattern, not just one horrific event.
What was driving this? Was it just soldiers running wild or something more systemic?
The material points strongly towards systemic issues, particularly Army policy itself. There was immense pressure for very high body counts.
Body counts is the measure of success.
Exactly. And this policy directly resulted in dead civilians being marked down as combatants. It created this perverse incentive structure.
So killing civilians could actually help units meet their quotas.
That seems to be the implication. Major General Julian Ewell, who commanded the 9th Infantry Division, even wrote a confidential report describing parts of the countryside resembling Verdun because of the indiscriminate killing. It wasn't just a breakdown, it was baked into the system.
That's chilling. Using metrics that dehumanize and incentivize killing.
It shows what can happen when the metrics of war get completely detached from human reality.
And the memorial at My Lai, the Sinmu Memorial Museum, it lists the names, doesn't it?
It does. A large black marble plaque right at the entrance lists all 504 civilians killed there by U.S. troops.
504.
And the details.
It's agonizing. The list includes 17 pregnant women and 210 children under the age of 13.
Oh, God. 210 children.
It puts a very real human face on that abstract body count policy, just devastating.
What about accountability for My Lai? Someone must have paid the price.
Well, it's complicated, and many would say deeply unsatisfactory. Second Lieutenant William Calley, a platoon leader, was charged with murdering 102 civilians. He was found guilty, sentenced to life.
Okay, so a conviction. Yes, but he was paroled in September 1974, after serving only a fraction of his sentence, much of it under house arrest. His sentence reductions were controversial.
And what about higher-ups? The people who gave the orders or oversaw the operation?
That's where it gets really problematic. Colonel Orrin K. Henderson, who actually ordered the attack and flew over the village during the massacre, he faced charges. Major General Samuel Custer, the division commander, also faced charges, mostly related to cover-up, dereliction of duty, false swearing. The charges were later dropped, or they resulted in acquittals, so the guy on the ground gets a conviction, albeit a reduced one, while the leadership largely walks away.
That raises huge questions about command responsibility, doesn't it? And the military justice system's willingness to hold senior officers accountable.
Absolutely. It points to systemic failures and accountability at the highest levels.
But amidst all that darkness, the museum also highlights some heroes, right? Americans who tried to stop it or expose it.
Yes, absolutely crucial to remember them. Ronald Ridenhour, he was the soldier who really exposed the massacre. He painstakingly collected sworn statements from other soldiers and wrote letters to government officials demanding an investigation.
He refused to let it stay buried.
Exactly. And then there was the helicopter crew chief Hugh Thompson and his gunner Lawrence Colburn. They actively intervened during the massacre.
What did they do?
They landed their helicopter between the American soldiers and fleeing Vietnamese civilians. Thompson ordered Colburn to fire on the American troops if they continued killing the villagers. They physically saved people's lives at great personal risk.
Wow. Threatening to fire on their own side to stop a massacre. Incredible courage.
They are rightly celebrated as heroes. Their actions show that even in the worst circumstances, individuals can make a choice for humanity.
Okay, so from Vietnam, let's jump forward again back to the Iraq War. The Mahmoudiya massacre. It feels like a microcosm of just absolute depravity.
It really does. March 12, 2006, traffic checkpoint number 2, 6 American soldiers involved: Paul Cortez, James Barker, Stephen Green, Jesse Spillman, Brian Howard, and Seth Scheller.
And what happened was just unspeakable.
Unspeakable is the right word. The gang rape and murder of a 14-year-old girl, Abir Qasim al-Janabi. And then the execution of her family, her father, her mother, and her 2 younger siblings. All in their home.
It wasn't combat. It was a calculated, brutal crime.
Absolutely. Planned and executed with chilling callousness.
And the mindset. Stephen Dale Green's quote is just burned into my memory.
I wasn't thinking these people were humans. It's the absolute core of dehumanization, isn't it? And it wasn't a sudden snap. He'd apparently talked about wanting to kill Iraqi civilians before. And the idea to assault Abir reportedly came from Corporal James Barker, who was senior to Green. He noted the house was isolated, only one adult male present. It suggests planning, predation.
And after they did this.
They apparently celebrated, grilled chicken wings, jumped for joy. Green reportedly said, "It was great."
Celebrated. That level of detachment is just monstrous.
Yeah.
A complete moral vacuum.
It really defies understanding.
Reporting something like that must have been incredibly dangerous for anyone who knew.
Immensely so. Private Justin Watt eventually reported what he knew, but he said he was terrified, felt like he was a dead man.
Why? What happened?
After he reported it, he was publicly identified. And his superior, a guy named Kunk, apparently abandoned him, dismissed his report as just third-hand information.
Discouraging the report.
Worse. Kunk apparently asked Watt why he would ruin his fellow soldiers' careers. It shows the immense pressure to stay silent, the hostility whistleblowers face, that culture of silence enabling impunity.
Turning a blind eye becomes complicity.
Effectively, yes.
What happened legally in this case? Was there justice?
It was uneven. Stephen Dale Green was the only one tried in a civilian court because he'd been discharged from the Army before the crimes came to light. He got a life sentence.
And the others?
They were court-martialed. Some received lengthy sentences after pleading guilty, like Barker and Cortez. Others received shorter sentences or were acquitted on some charges. Green himself complained about what he called drastically disproportionate treatment.
He thought he was treated unfairly compared to the others.
Yes. The prosecutor, Brian Scarrett, pushed hard for the death penalty for Green, calling him the triggerman and ringleader. But Green's lawyer suggested politics played a role, noting that plea deals were accepted from others.
So questions again about consistency and fairness in the justice system, especially in these horrific, high-profile cases.
Exactly. Was it about the severity of the crime, or were other factors influencing the outcomes? It leaves that lingering question. And stepping back from these specific awful incidents, we really need to talk about the broader scale of civilian casualties in the Iraq War. The sheer number, the unseen toll.
Yeah, estimating the deaths is notoriously difficult, isn't it? The numbers seem to be all over the place.
They really are. It's fraught with challenges. You had the Lancet study, for instance, which estimated around 601,000 violent deaths through mid-2006, a huge number.
But that one was controversial methodologically.
Very much so. Criticized for its sampling. Then you have the Iraq Family Health Survey, using a different method, which came up with 151,000 deaths for a slightly shorter period. Much lower, but still enormous.
And then even higher figures.
Yeah, the Opinion Research Bureau, ORB, estimated over 1 million killed by 2007. That was also challenged methodologically. It just highlights how hard it is to get a reliable count in a war zone.
So the true number is likely unknown, really.
Precisely. Somewhere within that vast contested range. The Iraq Body Count Project tries a different approach. They cross-check media reports, morgue data, hospital records. They focus only on documented civilian killings, excluding combatants.
Trying to be more verifiable.
Right. But even they acknowledge, and independent scholars agree, that relying on media reports in a chaotic war zone almost certainly undercounts the true number of dead. Things just don't get reported.
So even their figures are likely a low estimate.
Very likely, yes. The actual toll is probably much higher than any easily quantifiable number. It's an unseen tragedy in many ways. And counting the dead itself becomes politicized, doesn't it? Different methods give different numbers.
And it wasn't just direct violence, was it? The war had knock-on effects.
Absolutely. The indirect deaths are a huge, often overlooked part of the story. When infrastructure collapses, water treatment, electricity for hospitals, and refrigeration, people die from preventable causes.
Like lack of clean water, sanitation.
Exactly. Cholera outbreaks become deadly. Lack of medicine means treatable conditions like TB or cancer become fatal. Food spoils.
And Iraq's infrastructure was already weak before the 2003 invasion, right?
Devastated. Decades of previous wars, plus the impact of UN sanctions. So the 2003 war just compounded an already dire situation. These indirect deaths represent this massive silent wave of suffering. And then there are the wounds that last long after the fighting stops. The hidden wounds.
Like unexploded bombs.
Yes, unexploded ordnance. Iraq is one of the most heavily contaminated countries in the world. Bombs, mines, shells left over from multiple conflicts. They keep killing and maiming people for years, decades.
Is there support for the victims?
The ICRC supports about 13 centers providing prosthetics, orthotics, but the scale of the need is immense. An estimated 156,000 people need physical rehab, requiring over 52,000 new devices every year.
Every year.
Yeah.
So the legacy of war keeps creating new victims.
Constantly.
And the psychological trauma. PTSD.
The invisible wounds.
Yeah.
Just as devastating. Dr. Haider Maliki, back in 2010, estimated that around 28% of Iraqi children suffered from some degree of PTSD.
28%. How many children is that?
That translates to more than 3 million Iraqi children.
3 million.
It's a staggering number, an entire generation profoundly affected. It's a silent epidemic that will shape Iraqi society for decades to come. Now let's talk about drone strikes, another area where civilian casualties are a major concern, and where there's this persistent gap between official numbers and what outside groups report.
Yeah, this discrepancy seems really significant. The U.S. government consistently reports very low numbers of civilian deaths from drone strikes, right?
Extremely low, often single digits or even zero for certain periods. But non-governmental organizations, NGOs, who track these strikes, often report figures that are dramatically higher.
And scholars like Nicholas Grossman point out this pattern, suggesting official figures systematically underestimated civilian casualties. So it's not just NGOs saying this.
Right. There's a recognized ongoing issue here.
So how does the government explain this difference? Why are their numbers so much lower?
Well, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, gives basically three reasons. First, they say they use refined and honed post-strike analysis methods, better than what NGOs have.
Okay, better methods.
Second, they rely on sensitive intelligence stuff NGOs don't see to classify people as combatants, even if they might look like civilians in, say, grainy drone footage or initial reports.
So they might count someone as a combatant where an NGO would count them as a civilian?
Potentially, yes, based on intelligence the public never sees. And third, they claim terrorist groups deliberately spread misinformation in local media, which NGOs sometimes rely on, skewing the NGO counts upwards.
So the official line is, we have better intel, better methods, and NGOs are sometimes misled.
That's the essence of it. It positions the government numbers as the more accurate, reliable count.
But the persistence of the discrepancy itself makes you question that, doesn't it? If they're grading their own homework.
Exactly. It raises fundamental questions about transparency and accountability. How can we verify the official claims when the underlying intelligence is secret?
Was there ever an attempt to mandate more transparency?
There was. President Obama issued an executive order on July 1st, 2016. It required an annual public report due May 1st each year, accounting for civilian and enemy deaths from strikes outside active war zones.
A step towards openness.
It was seen that way, yes. Limited, but a step.
But that didn't last, did it?
No. Under President Trump, large parts of Yemen and Somalia were designated areas of active hostilities. This conveniently exempted strikes there from the reporting requirement under Obama's order.
Ah, a loophole.
A pretty big one. And then the administration just missed the reporting deadlines for 2017 and 2018 anyway. And finally, on March 6, 2019, the executive order requiring the report was revoked entirely.
So back to less transparency. What about Congress? Have they mandated anything?
Congress has, since 2016, required the Defense Department to release annual reports on bystander deaths from all its military operations, including inside war zones like Afghanistan and Syria. That's separate legislation, like Section 1057 of the NDAA for FY 2018.
Okay, so DOD has to report.
Yes, but crucially, that requirement does not extend to separate CIA drone strikes.
Ah, so the CIA's drone program remains largely outside this public reporting mandate.
That's correct. It creates this significant gap in transparency, allowing a major component of U.S. drone warfare to operate with much less public scrutiny regarding civilian casualties.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears now into something maybe even murkier. Covert actions, illegal funding, state-sponsored terror. This brings us to Operation Gladio. Which honestly sounds like fiction.
It really does, but it's confirmed history. The big revelation came in August 1990. The Italian Prime Minister at the time, Giulio Andreotti, was essentially forced to admit it existed.
Admit what exactly?
The existence of a secret army. Not just in Italy, but he confirmed it operated in other NATO countries too, coordinated by NATO itself through its unorthodox warfare section.
A secret NATO army network across Western Europe.
Yes, codenamed Gladio in Italy, but it had different names elsewhere. Absalon in Denmark, for example. Its public confirmation sent shockwaves across Europe. Decades of secrecy just shattered.
What was its purpose? Why set up these secret armies?
Ostensibly, it was set up after World War II by the US CIA and Britain's MI6. The stated goal was to be a stay-behind force.
Stay behind, meaning?
Meaning, if the Soviets invaded Western Europe, these secret units would stay behind enemy lines to conduct guerrilla warfare, sabotage, resistance. That was the official rationale.
Okay, and it was super secret.
Incredibly so. Coordinated by very hush-hush committees within NATO's military headquarters, Shape E, committees like the Allied Clandestine Committee, ACC, and the Clandestine Planning Committee, CPC. These things operated outside normal democratic oversight for decades. The ACC was apparently still meeting as late as October 1990, right as the scandal broke.
But it wasn't just about waiting for an invasion, was it? The material suggests it got involved in something much darker, the strategy of tension.
Exactly. That's where it gets really disturbing.
Yeah.
In Italy, particularly, Gladio elements and factions within the military secret services were linked to what's called the terror of the right.
What did that involve?
Planting bombs, indiscriminately.
Yeah.
In public places, banks, train stations, squares, designed to strike fear to the bones of the entire society.
Why? What was the goal?
To create chaos and fear, and then wrongly blame the communists for the attacks. The idea was to push the public towards demanding a more authoritarian state for security and to discredit the political left.
False flag terrorism, sponsored by elements within the state.
That's precisely what investigations like Judge Cassin's into the Pictiano bombing concluded.
Oh.
And the Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan in 1969 killed 16, maimed 80 investigators found the military secret service covered it up and planted evidence to frame anarchists. It was a deliberate strategy.
There's a quote from a right-wing terrorist, Vincenzo Vinciguerra, that just lays it bare.
Yeah, it's chilling. He said, "You had to attack civilians, the people, women, children, innocent people. The reason was quite simple. They were supposed to force these people to turn to the state to ask for greater security."
A deliberate targeting of innocents for political manipulation.
Exactly. And General Gerardo Serravalle, who actually commanded Gladio units, later confirmed that some members could shift from a defensive post-invasion role to one of attack of civil war. It confirms they weren't just passive stay-behind units, they were capable of internal destabilization.
And this connects to broader political meddling too, right? Even before Gladio was public knowledge.
Oh, definitely. Like in Italy's 1948 election, the CIA openly pumped 10 million CIA dollars into the Christian Democrats to stop the left from winning, using smear campaigns, anonymous pamphlets about candidate sex lives, blatant interference.
So this kind of covert manipulation was happening for a long time.
Decades. And when Andreotti finally spilled the beans about Gladio, saying, "Each chief of government has been informed," it caused huge embarrassment. Former prime ministers who denied knowing about it were suddenly contradicted, like Bettino Craxi, who was shown a document he'd signed about Gladio.
The cover-ups were extensive.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just Italy. The Belgian parliament discovered their secret NATO army was still active in October 1990, holding meetings. The head of Belgian military intelligence initially lied about it before being forced to admit it. It showed how entrenched these structures were, operating in the shadows.
And the links go even deeper, connecting to some really nasty stuff, like torture.
Yeah, a BBC documentary called The Unleashing of Evil revealed that British SAS and U.S. Green Berets had systematically used torture against prisoners over the past 30 years in every major campaign, naming places like Kenya, Northern Ireland, Oman, Vietnam, Cyprus.
So torture wasn't just isolated incidents, but a tool used in covert ops.
That's what the documentary alleged, suggesting it was a systemic practice in certain special forces circles, often linked to these kinds of unorthodox warfare operations.
And training. Some truly awful groups were trained.
Disturbingly, yes. One top-secret operation involved U.S. Green Berets training genocide Khmer Rouge units in Cambodia after their horrific rule.
Wait, training the Khmer Rouge after the killing fields.
That's what the material states. SAS officers later testified they trained the Khmer Rouge in a lot of technical stuff, but found it hard to stop them from, quote, just chopping people up. They said, "We are soldiers, not child murderers."
That raises profound ethical questions about who these forces were partnering with and training, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The potential consequences.
Catastrophic and arguably foreseeable. A chilling example of short-term strategic goals potentially leading to complicity and mass atrocity.
And these alliances extended to other groups, too. Mafia, far-right extremists.
Yes, based on their perceived usefulness against communism. In Italy, former CIA agent Victor Marchetti stated the CIA sided with the mafia and right-wing extremists because they were anti-communist, basically to control Italy.
A deal with the devil, essentially.
It seems that way. And in Turkey, a similar pattern. The CIA heavily recruited among the ultranationalist Grey Wolves to staff the Turkish stay-behind unit, the counter-guerrilla.
And the Grey Wolves were linked to violence.
Significant state-supported terror, yes, including assassinations of prominent journalists like Abdi Apekci and Ugur Mumku. It suggests a consistent pattern: prioritize anti-communism, even if it means partnering with violent, extremist, or criminal elements.
Can we link Gladio to specific events in other countries, like coups?
The material points to Greece in 1967. The Greek Special Forces, LOK, were integrated into the NATO stay-behind network. The CIA reportedly instructed them to prevent a leftist takeover.
And then there was a coup.
Yes, in 1967, led by Colonel George Papadopoulos. Significantly, Papadopoulos had been the Greek intelligence liaison officer with the CIA since 1952.
That seems more than coincidental.
It certainly raises questions. The U.S. ambassador reportedly called it a rape of democracy. The CIA station chief's reported reply was incredibly cynical. How can you rape a whore?
Wow. Just complete dismissal of democratic principles if they got in the way.
It suggests a very hard-nosed, realpolitik attitude prevailed in some quarters.
What about Belgium, those Brabant massacres?
Yeah, those were a series of brutal, seemingly random attacks in the 80s. Supermarkets, etc., designed again to strike fear to the bones of the population.
Linked to Gladio.
A 1990 Belgian parliamentary report linked them to members or former members of the security forces, extreme right-wingers who enjoyed high-level protection and were preparing a right-wing coup. Again, that strategy of tension pattern.
And even the Aldo Moro murder in Italy.
Yes, the murder of the Italian statesman Aldo Moro in 1978, while primarily carried out by the Red Brigades, was later confirmed to have involved elements linked to Operation Gladio. It shows the network's potential reach into incredibly high-stakes political events.
The level of secrecy must have been immense.
Yeah.
How did the agencies respond when asked about it?
The CIA, when hit with Freedom of Information Act requests about Gladio, typically gave the standard can neither confirm nor deny response. Total stonewall.
And the British, MI6.
Their confirmation came much later and weirdly through a museum exhibition in London in 1995 called Secret Wars. It just casually mentioned MI6's role in setting up stay-behind parties.
A museum exhibit. That's an odd way to confirm involvement in decades of secret armies.
It really is. It speaks volumes about the culture of secrecy and how information eventually trickles out, often long after it matters politically.
Now, we should probably mention there is some debate about the research on Gladio, right? Specifically Daniel Ganser's book.
Yes, that's important context. Ganser's book, NATO's Secret Armies, was hugely influential in bringing Gladio to public attention. But it has faced criticism from other scholars.
What kind of criticism?
Scholars like Pierre-Henrik Hansen, Hayden Peake, Philip Davies, Olav Rist. They've described it as maybe overly journalistic, sometimes veering into conspiracy theories. They argue it doesn't always fully document its claims or put things in proper historical context. Some also question his reliance on a specific U.S. Army field manual, FM 3031B, which they argue is a forgery.
So the existence of Gladio is confirmed, NATO coordination is confirmed, links to the strategy of tension seem widely accepted. But some of the more extreme claims or interpretations are debated.
Exactly. The core facts are established, but the full scope and interpretation of all its alleged activities remain areas of scholarly discussion and require careful sourcing.
Okay, let's turn to another infamous chapter of CIA activity, Project MKUltra. The mind control experiments.
Yeah, this one is deeply disturbing on an ethical level. MKUltra started back in April 1953, and the sheer scope of the experimentation was, frankly, chilling.
What were they doing?
Administering psychoactive drugs, especially LSD, but others too, and crucially, doing it to people who often couldn't consent or resist.
Like who?
The documentation mentions mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and prostitutes. People described by one officer as those who could not fight back. In one case, a mental patient in Kentucky was given LSD for 174 consecutive days.
174 days. That's horrific.
It is. And it wasn't just vulnerable populations. They also tested on unsuspecting CIA employees, military personnel, doctors, even the general public, all trying to find ways to elicit deep confessions, or even, chillingly, to wipe someone's mind and program them as a robot agent.
And threatening people to keep quiet.
Yes, military personnel involved were apparently threatened with courts-martial if they talked. Extreme secrecy and coercion.
The ethical violations here seem just blatant.
Absolutely. Conducting experiments without the subject's knowledge or informed consent is a direct violation of the Nuremberg Code.
The code established after Nazi experiments, which the U.S. agreed to follow.
Precisely. For the CIA to knowingly bypass those fundamental ethics for decades, it points to a really troubling institutional mindset where the ends were seen to justify almost any means.
And people were harmed. People died.
Yes. The most famous case is Frank Olson, a U.S. Army scientist. He died in November 1953, just days after being unknowingly dosed with LSD as part of an MKUltra experiment.
What happened afterwards?
His family eventually sued and received a $750,000 settlement from the government in the 1970s. President Ford and CIA Director William Coley issued formal apologies.
A full apology for the program.
Not exactly. The apologies were specifically limited to the informed consent issues regarding Olson's LSD ingestion, not a broader admission of the systemic violations across the whole MKUltra program. A very carefully worded apology.
And didn't they destroy the records, making it hard to know the full extent?
Yes, that's a crucial part of the cover-up. In 1973, just before leaving office, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of thousands of MKUltra files,
Boy.
presumably to prevent them from coming to light in investigations. It massively hampered later efforts, like the Senate committees that looked into it in 1977.
But we might never know the full story.
That's what the Senate committees concluded. Because of the destroyed records, the lack of informed consent, the uncontrolled nature of the experiments, they stated that the full impact of MKUltra experiments, including deaths, may never be known. The complete truth is likely lost. Moving to more recent times, another area raising serious human rights concerns is the CIA's role with paramilitary or army units in Afghanistan.
Right, these Afghan units supported by the CIA, like the National Directorate of Security, the NDS Special Forces, and the Coast Protection Force.
Exactly. The CIA helped establish and support these groups, and their operations expanded significantly, especially after 2017 when then CIA Director Pompeo announced a policy shift to rely on them more heavily against the Taliban and al-Qaeda.
So, increased reliance on these paramilitary groups. What was the impact?
A significant increase in civilian casualties linked to their operations. The UN expressed deep concern. In 2018 alone, the UN documented a stunning 185% increase in civilian deaths and injuries from search operations conducted by these pro-government forces. 353 killed and injured in just 1 year from those specific operations.
That's a massive jump.
Huge. And the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, stressed these numbers are likely conservative, as documentation is difficult. They also noted that in 2018, these CIA-backed paramilitaries caused almost as many civilian deaths as all regular Afghan army and police forces combined.
Wow, so these specific units were disproportionately lethal to civilians.
The figures strongly suggest that, yes.
Did the UN report say why they were causing so many casualties? Was it just collateral damage?
The report drew a more disturbing conclusion. It pointed to the high ratio of deaths to injuries in these operations, meaning it suggests a pattern of intentional killing and excessive use of force. It wasn't just accidental deaths during firefights. It implied deliberate killings, possibly during night raids or searches, with insufficient regard for distinguishing civilians.
So, potential violations of the rules of engagement.
That's the implication. A pattern suggesting something more than tragic accidents.
And was there accountability for these killings? Were people investigated or prosecuted?
That's another major problem highlighted. A system of politicized justice leading to widespread impunity. Meaning very few cases have been investigated and even fewer prosecuted. The rare cases that did see prosecution often seemed linked to the victim's political connections.
Exactly.
Like 38 members of a Kandahar strike force convicted in 2009 for killing a local police chief, someone with influence. Or a Coast Protection Force unit killing a boy in 2015 whose family was politically well-connected.
So, justice depended on who you knew, not necessarily on the crime itself.
It suggests that, yes, a system where these powerful, often autonomously operating paramilitary groups could largely evade accountability unless the victim had powerful friends or the case caused a public outcry. It created a climate of fear and injustice for ordinary civilians.
Okay, let's broaden out again. We've talked about direct actions, covert ops. What about funding? How can providing money, specifically military aid, contribute to human rights issues? The case of U.S. aid to Israel comes up here.
Yes, it's a really stark and highly relevant example. DaleDion.com, the news organization, presents a strong argument. They state the U.S.'s financial and military support of Israel for decades is the reason why the Zionist state is able to carry out the genocide in Palestine and war crimes in Lebanon.
So they're drawing a direct causal link between the aid and the alleged actions.
They are. From that perspective, the aid isn't just support, it's an enabler, making the provider implicitly complicit in the actions carried out using that support. It's a critical lens for understanding international aid in conflict.
And the amount of aid is significant.
Hugely significant. Since just October 7th, 2023, the U.S. has enacted legislation providing at least $12.5 billion in military aid to Israel.
$12.5 billion since last October.
Yes. That includes $3.8 billion in a March 2024 bill, consistent with the longstanding agreement, plus another $8.7 billion in a Supplemental Appropriations Act in April 2024. It's a massive influx of military resources.
How does this aid usually work? Is it just cash?
It primarily comes as grants under the Foreign Military Financing Program, FMF. Generally, Israel has to use these funds to buy U.S. military equipment and services.
So it benefits U.S. defense contractors too?
Largely, yes, though there's an exception. Israel can use up to 25% of the FMF funds to buy from its own defense firms, which helps develop their domestic industry.
And this is a long-term thing?
Very long term. As of last October, Israel had nearly 600 active FMF cases open, totaling around $24 billion. It underscores a deep, continuous financial and military relationship that fundamentally shapes Israel's capabilities.
Now, the sources list a lot of allegations against Israeli forces, both historically and very recently. Can you give us an overview?
Yes, the material details a wide range, spanning decades, but focusing heavily on the current conflicts, the 2023 present Gaza war and the Israel-Hezbollah conflict. Historically, it mentions the Beit Jala incident in 1952, where Israeli forces killed 7 Palestinian civilians, including women and children, in what the UN Truce Supervision Organization called an indiscriminate retaliation.
So concerns about indiscriminate force go way back.
They do. And for the current conflicts, the allegations documented are extensive and severe. They include things like collective punishment, the blockade of Gaza, restricting water, creating starvation conditions, especially harming children. Forcible transfer of populations is alleged. The use of white phosphorus in densely populated areas.
White phosphorus, that's the incendiary weapon.
Yes, controversial due to the severe burns it causes and its potential for indiscriminate effects.
And indiscriminate attacks generally.
That's a major theme. Airstrikes on refugee camps like Al-Shati and Jabalia, hitting UNRWA schools, churches, civilian apartment blocks like the Engineers Building. Specific incidents like the Flower Massacre during aid distribution, the drone strikes that killed World Central Kitchen workers, killings at aid points in Rafah.
A pattern suggesting civilians aren't being adequately protected.
That's the core of the allegation attacks that allegedly fail to distinguish combatants from civilians or cause disproportionate harm. Violations of medical neutrality are also cited attacks on hospitals, ambulances, medical staff.
What about journalists?
A huge point of concern. The material states nearly 75% of all journalists killed worldwide in 2023 died covering the war in Gaza. An unprecedented number. A Reporters Without Borders investigation concluded a Reuters reporter's vehicle was explicitly targeted.
Deliberately targeting journalists.
That's the finding of that specific investigation. There are also reports of widespread looting of homes in Gaza by soldiers, behavior the IDF's own top lawyer reportedly warned crossed the criminal threshold.
And even more severe allegations.
Yeah.
Executions.
Yes. Reports of summary executions, like the video showing the aftermath of 15 men killed in a Gaza City apartment, an Israeli soldier allegedly bragging online about killing an elderly Palestinian, the concept of kill zones, where anyone crossing an invisible line is shot.
Killing surrendered people, too.
That's alleged as well, including Palestinians and even Israeli hostages who were waving white flags. A clear violation of the laws of war, if true. The list continues. Enforced disappearance of detainees. Widespread abuse and sexual humiliation of detainees, including allegations of sexual violence, the use of perfidy soldiers allegedly disguising themselves as civilians.
And human shields.
Yes, specific alleged instances in the West Bank and Gaza, and even claims of a systemic practice of forcing Palestinians into tunnels to check for explosives ahead of soldiers. And overarching all this, the very grave allegation of genocide, which is currently being examined by international courts.
And just recently, there was that incident with Iran.
Right. Truthout reported on U.S. lawmakers cheering an Israeli attack on Iran, an attack which a UN expert described as likely a war crime. It just highlights how these alleged violations of international law continue to be a live, pressing issue with significant political and legal dimensions directly relevant to U.S. foreign policy and support.
We've covered specific incidents, funding. Let's zoom out to systemic issues. This idea of blowback. Unintended consequences of covert actions.
Yeah, blowback is a really important concept, popularized by Chalmers Johnson. It's essentially the unintended negative repercussions of secret foreign policy actions that rebound or blow back onto the country that initiated them.
So secret actions having unforeseen negative results down the line.
Exactly. It challenges the idea that you can just intervene secretly and control all the outcomes cleanly.
And is it possible to predict these consequences?
Well, the essay, Covert Action and Unintended Consequences, argues it's simply impossible to forecast the potential unintended consequences beyond the very short term. There's an inherent unpredictability.
A fundamental blind spot in planning these things.
That's the argument. You just can't know all the ripples your actions will create in a complex system over time. And this difficulty is often made worse by decision-making biases. Policymakers can operate with delusional optimism, the essay suggests.
Delusional optimism.
Meaning they tend to overestimate gains and chances of success while underestimating odds of failure and the long-term threat from ripples in the pond. The desire for a quick win can overshadow a rational look at long-term risks,
leading to a cycle of intervention and unforeseen negative consequences.
That's the danger highlighted.
Can you give some historical examples of this blowback?
The 1953 Iran coup, Operation TP Ajax, is a classic one. The US and UK overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh, restored the Shah. Short-term goal achieved. Control over oil, pro-Western leader.
But long-term?
Long-term, it fostered deep resentment among Iranians about foreign meddling. It poisoned relations and is widely seen as a major contributing factor to the anti-American sentiment that fueled the 1979 revolution, creating decades of hostility. The initial success had massive negative blowback.
Any other examples?
The sources also mention U.S. support for the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan, which inadvertently helped create al-Qaeda, and intervention in Syria, which arguably contributed to the rise of ISIS. Clear examples where short-term actions had devastating, unintended long-term consequences. Now let's look at the broader impact of the post-9/11 global war on terror on human rights globally. That declaration led to a rapid creation of new laws and policies everywhere.
And these counterterrorism measures, while intended for security, they've been widely misused, haven't they?
Hugely misused, yes. Anti-terrorism and anti-extremism laws have become tools for many states to stifle dissent and control public discourse.
How? Who gets targeted?
Often, it's not actual terrorists. It's political opponents, human rights defenders, NGOs, journalists, minority groups, anyone seen as critical or inconvenient to the government. The laws provide a convenient pretext for crackdowns. We see this pattern globally. In Russia, their vague anti-extremism law, Federal Law 114-FZ from 2002, has been used against all sorts of groups, NGOs, media like Meta and Medusa, Jehovah's Witnesses, LGBTQ+ movements. The lack of a clear definition of extremism allows arbitrary application.
And India.
There, the material points to hostile rhetoric and policies by the ruling BJP against Muslim citizens, increased violations, targeting of Muslim journalists and activists, plus discriminatory laws like anti-cow slaughter or anti-conversion laws are used to fuel hate crimes by vigilante groups against Muslims.
Using legal frameworks to marginalize minorities.
Effectively, yes. In China, the Strike Hard campaign against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang is justified under counterterrorism, but involves mass internment, torture, forced labor, a systematic attempt to erase Uyghur identity.
And Hungary.
Hungary used anti-terrorism narratives to justify cracking down on immigration, declaring a state of crisis, building fences, criminalizing aid to refugees with the Stop Soros laws, weaponizing security fears against migrants.
So why is this misuse so widespread? Is there a systemic failure?
The analysis points to a triple failure at the multilateral level. First, UN Security Council resolutions didn't include clear, binding definitions of terrorism, leaving states too much room for interpretation.
Okay, lack of definition.
Second, there was a failure to require comprehensive human rights impact assessments before states adopted these powerful counterterrorism measures. And third, immense pressure, especially post-9/11, to pass laws quickly without proper public debate or judicial review.
So vague laws, no impact assessment, rushed adoption.
Exactly. It created this global environment of exceptionality, where states felt they could bypass normal human rights rules and due process in the name of security, leading to the widespread abuses we see. Finally, let's talk about secrecy itself. Information control and how it affects public debate around these kinds of operations.
Right. It seems obvious, but if these black operations, cyber attacks like Stuxnet against Iran, drone strikes, special ops missions if they're kept secret, how can anyone debate them?
Precisely. The secrecy actively prevented debate over the wisdom and legality of these actions. The public, even many elected officials, often don't know the full details or even that they're happening. So no meaningful democratic oversight or discussion about the ethics or consequences is possible. Decisions get made in the shadows.
David Sanger, the journalist, made an interesting comparison, didn't he, between cyber warfare now and the early nuclear age.
Yeah, it's a powerful analogy. He said, we're sort of with cyber where we were with nuclear weapons between, say, 1945 and 1949. Meaning, the U.S. had the capability, knew others were developing it, but there is no real public acknowledgement or debate about the implications, the rules, the dangers. Sanger suggests cyber warfare is in a similar state now, rapidly developing capability with insufficient public understanding or debate about norms and controls.
That's a sobering thought. Operating without agreed-upon rules in such a potent new domain.
Very sobering. The lack of transparency stifles any chance to build those rules.
And this control over information, it even extends to intelligence analysis itself, doesn't it? How human rights issues are factored in or not.
Yes, there's an argument that intelligence analysis on human rights, even seemingly small abuses, can be like canaries in the coal mine.
Warning signs.
Exactly. They can signal underlying instability, grievances, potential for larger crises.
Hmm.
If intelligence agencies include robust human rights analysis, it gives policymakers a more complete, nuanced picture. Ignoring it or keeping it separate from hard security analysis mean you might miss crucial warnings.
So transparency about human rights issues within intelligence could actually be strategically valuable, not just ethically right.
That's the argument. A more complete picture leads to better predictions and potentially avoids bigger problems down the line. Suppressing or compartmentalizing that information doesn't just hinder accountability, it can lead to poorer policy decisions based on incomplete intelligence. Openness, in this sense, isn't just an ethical ideal, but potentially a strategic necessity.
So wrapping this up, we've covered a lot of ground today, a deep dive into some really challenging territory. Documented war crimes, human rights violations.
Yeah, the complex web of covert operations, that idea of blowback, the role of funding, and these systemic problems of accountability and secrecy.
Our goal really was just to lay out the factual terrain based on the material we reviewed. Not to take sides, but to give you, the listener, the information.
Because being well-informed, especially about these difficult truths, it's the first step. The first step towards thinking critically, asking deeper questions about how power operates in the world.
Exactly. We've laid out the landscape for you to continue your own exploration.
And maybe leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Yeah.
In a world that is becoming more interconnected, more transparent, where secrets are harder to keep forever, how might the long-term, often unseen costs and consequences of these secret actions continue shaping things?
Yeah.
Global stability, our very understanding of justice, long after the immediate goals are forgotten.
A question that definitely echoes through everything we've discussed today, something to keep thinking about.